as the stagecoach arrived in a cloud of prairie dust. Among its weary passengers stepped Margaret Sullivan, a mail-order bride whose dreams were as vast as the Texas horizon. Her emerald eyes, bright with hope, took in the wooden buildings and dirt streets of what she prayed would be her new home. But hope, like the setting sun, can fade quickly in the West. One by one, potential suitors turned away, their judgment as harsh as the frontier itself. Through bitter tears, she began packing her meager belongings, ready to return east in shame, until fate arrived on horseback. Jackson Wheeler's reputation preceded him, cattle baron, horse whisperer, a man who built an empire from nothing. But it was his eyes that changed everything. They saw past surfaces to souls, beyond appearances to truth. What secrets would this unlikely pair discover beneath the vast Texas sky? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Margaret sat in her family's modest Boston apartment, smoothing the wrinkles from a newspaper clipping with trembling fingers. The advertisement was already worn at the creases from countless readings. Seeking God-fearing. Ladies of good character for marriage to established gentlemen in Silver Creek, Texas, must be willing to embrace frontier life. Reference from minister required. The golden light of sunset filtered through lace curtains her mother had made years ago, before arthritis twisted her once nimble fingers. From the next room came the sound of her father's cough, deeper now, more frequent. The doctor's bills, piled up on the kitchen table like autumn leaves, each one a reminder of what had driven her to consider such a drastic step. Margaret drew out the bundle of letters from her dresser drawer, each one carefully tied with a blue ribbon. The first response from Silver Creek had arrived 2 months ago, written in Mrs. Henderson's precise hand. The boarding house owner had become her primary correspondent, describing the town, its people, and the opportunities awaiting a woman of strong character and domestic skills. The West needs women who aren't afraid of hard work, Mrs. Henderson had written. Women who can see beauty in wide-open spaces and possibility in untamed lands. Your letters speak of such strength, dear Margaret. Those words had given her courage, even as her mother wept and her father argued against her decision. They couldn't understand that she was choosing this path not just for herself, but for them. The position she held as a seamstress barely covered their basic needs, let alone her father's mounting medical expenses. Margaret caught her reflection in the window glass, fuller figured than the fashion plates deemed desirable, but with a face her mother called striking. High cheekbones, clear, green eyes, and thick auburn hair that refused to be tamed by pins and pomade. She had long since made peace with her appearance, finding strength in her capable hands and quick mind rather than society's narrow definition of beauty. The latest letter from Mrs. Henderson lay open on her lap. I have spoken with several respectable gentlemen who express interest in corresponding with a lady of your qualities. While I must be honest that frontier life is not easy, I believe you possess the spirit required to thrive here. The stagecoach runs weekly from St. Louis. Should you decide to join us, I will ensure you are met with Christian charity and given fair opportunity to find a suitable match. Margaret touched the small daguerreotype she would send west with her next letter. It was an honest portrait, showing her as she was, without artifice or pretense. Her mother had suggested having it retaken, perhaps with more flattering angles or shadows, but Margaret had refused. If I am to build a new life, she had said, it must be founded on truth. She sealed her response to Mrs. Henderson with careful drops of wax, her decision made. The letter contained her promise to arrive with the autumn stagecoach, along with a carefully worded paragraph about her appearance. Better to be forthright, she thought, than to face disappointment upon arrival. Outside her window, Boston's familiar spires reached toward the darkening sky. Soon she would trade these crowded streets for open plains, these brick walls for endless horizons. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt a curious sense of peace. Whatever awaited her in Silver Creek, she would face it, with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every other challenge life had presented. Margaret slipped the letters back into their hiding place, touching each one like a talisman of hope. In less than 3 months, she would board a train west, carrying little more than her father's blessing, her mother's tears, and her own unwavering resolve to forge a new destiny in an unknown land. The stagecoach's arrival in Silver Creek brought the usual flurry of activity to the dusty main street. Margaret gripped her carpet-bag tightly as the driver helped her down, her legs shaky from 3 days of constant motion. The October wind whipped at her skirts, carrying the scent of sage and cattle, and something wild she couldn't name. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the prospect of new arrivals. Margaret felt their eyes on her, heard the whispers begin. A woman near the general store touched her companion's arm, whispered something that made them both titter behind gloved hands. Margaret lifted her chin higher, though her heart pounded against her ribs. "Miss Sullivan?" The voice was warm, authoritative. A tall woman in a neat brown dress stepped forward, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. Welcome to Silver Creek." The boarding house owner's firm handshake and direct gaze matched the forthright tone of her letters. She dismissed the curious onlookers with a stern look, then guided Margaret toward a 2-story building, with fresh white paint and green shutters. "Don't mind them," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "Small towns run on gossip like steam engines run on coal. They'll find something new to whisper about soon enough." The boarding house interior was immaculate, smelling of beeswax and fresh bread. Mrs. Henderson led Margaret to a small but cheerful room on the 2nd floor, its window overlooking the street below. "I know it's not what you're used to in Boston," she began, but Margaret cut her off with a warm smile. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The clean simplicity of the room felt like a fresh start, unburdened by memories or expectations. That evening, over a supper of chicken and dumplings, Mrs. Henderson introduced Margaret to Silver Creek's other residents. There was Miss Abigail Porter, the schoolteacher, thin as a rail and sharp-eyed as a hawk. Mr. James Tucker, the telegraph operator, who blushed to his ears whenever anyone spoke to him directly. And the widow Chen, who ran the laundry and spoke little but saw everything. "3 gentlemen have expressed particular interest in meeting you," Mrs. Henderson said later as they sat in the parlor with cups of chamomile tea. "Mr. Peterson, the banker, Mr. Collins, who owns the Mercantile, and Mr. Whitaker, the owner of the Silver Creek Register." Margaret nodded, trying to quell the nervous flutter in her stomach. "When will I meet them?" "They'll call tomorrow, one at a time." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were kind but practical. "I should warn you, Miss Sullivan, men out here can be direct in their assessments. Try not to take it personally if they find me wanting." Margaret's smile held a trace of irony. "I assure you, Mrs. Henderson, I harbor no illusions about my appearance or my prospects." The older woman studied her for a long moment. "You know, Miss Sullivan, I've hosted 17 mail-order brides in this house over the past 5 years. Some were prettier than you, some plainer, some found husbands within days, others took months, but I've never met one with quite your strength of character." Margaret slept fitfully that night, dreaming of Boston spires that turned into endless prairie grass. In the morning, she dressed with particular care in her best grey wool dress, pinning her unruly hair into a modest style that emphasized her eyes rather than her full cheeks. The town was already alive with activity when she looked out her window. Cowboys rode past on rangy horses, their spurs jingling. A wagon loaded with timber creaked down the street. Children raced past on their way to school, their shouts carrying on the crisp autumn air. This could be home, she thought, if only... A knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Mrs. Henderson stood there, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Peterson is here to call, Miss Sullivan. Shall I show him up?" Margaret squared her shoulders, smoothed her skirts one final time. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready." She wasn't ready for the look in his eyes when he saw her, the barely concealed disappointment that would become all too familiar in the days ahead. Mr. Peterson's visit lasted exactly 7 minutes. He barely touched the tea Mrs. Henderson served, made no attempt at conversation beyond the most perfunctory pleasantries, and departed with a curt bow and mumbled excuse about urgent bank business. The carefully written marriage contract in his breast pocket remained there, unmentioned and unoffered. Margaret sat very still after he left, her tea growing cold in its delicate china cup. Mrs. Henderson busied herself straightening the already neat impala, giving her guest a moment to compose herself. "Well," Margaret said finally, her voice steady despite the burning in her throat, "I suppose that's one down." Mr. Collins, the mercantile owner, at least had the courtesy to stay for a full cup of tea. He asked intelligent questions about her experience with bookkeeping and household management, but his eyes never quite met hers, fixing instead on a point somewhere over her left shoulder. When he left, his relief was palpable. The worst was Mr. Whitaker from the newspaper. He arrived in a suit too fine for the frontier, reeking of bay, rum, and ambition. His gaze travelled over Margaret like a merchant assessing damaged goods. "You understand," he said, not unkindly, "that as the newspaper's publisher, my wife must be presentable, a social leader. The ladies of Silver Creek look to her for guidance in matters of fashion and deportment." "Of course," Margaret replied, her fingers twisting in her lap beneath the cover of her handkerchief. "I wouldn't wish to damage your standing in the community." That evening, she unpacked her trunk properly for the first time since arriving. Each item held memories, the practical dresses she'd sewn herself, the daguerreotype of her parents, her mother's well-worn Bible. At the bottom lay a sealed envelope, containing her return ticket to Boston, her father's insistence, despite their limited means. "Just in case," he'd said, pressing it into her hands at the station. A knock at her door revealed Mrs. Henderson bearing a tray with soup and fresh bread. "You missed supper," she said simply, setting it down on the small writing desk. "Margaret," I tried to smile. "I'm not very hungry." "Eat anyway." Mrs. Henderson's tone brooked no argument. She sat in the room's single wooden chair while Margaret obediently spooned up the soup. "There are other men in Silver Creek," she said after a while. "Not as wealthy, perhaps, but—" "Please," Margaret interrupted softly. "Don't." The next few days brought a parade of lesser prospects. A widowed rancher with 4 young children looked hopeful until his oldest daughter burst into tears at the sight of Margaret. A shopkeeper's assistant barely made it through the dudra before making his excuses. The farrier, a kind-faced man with massive shoulders, actually seemed interested until his sister paid a call to Mrs. Henderson, expressing concerns about the possibility of heavy children straining the family's resources. Each rejection carved away a little more of Margaret's resolve. She took to walking the town's outskirts in the early mornings before the streets filled with people who might recognize her. From the top of Miller's Hill, she could see the vastness of the Texas prairie stretching away to the horizon. To the north lay the Wheeler Ranch, its white-painted fences marking out an empire of grass and cattle. She'd heard talk of Jackson Wheeler in Mrs. Henderson's parlor. A self-made man, they said, started with nothing but a good eye for horseflesh and iron determination. Now his cattle brand was known across 3 states, and his horses were sought after by wealthy buyers from as far away as St. Louis. "He's never shown any interest in marriage," Miss Porter had said during afternoon tea, her voice carrying that peculiar mix of disapproval and fascination reserved for discussion of eligible bachelors. "Too busy building his kingdom," they say. Probably just as well. Can you imagine any woman being willing to live out there, miles from civilization? Margaret could imagine it quite well. The thought of space, of freedom from prying eyes and whispered judgments, held a powerful appeal. But such fantasies were pointless. She had been in Silver Creek for nearly 2 weeks, and her prospects were dwindling as quickly as her modest savings. That evening she took out her father's letter of credit and began calculating how much longer she could afford to stay at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The answer was depressingly clear. 1 more week, perhaps 2, if she was very careful with expenses. After that, she would have only enough for the train fare back to Boston. The thought of returning home in defeat made her chest tight with shame. What would her parents say? How would they manage the doctor's bills without the hope of assistance from a prosperous marriage? She was still wrestling with these thoughts when she heard it, hoofbeats on the street below, moving at a steady lope. A rider was coming into town. The rider emerged from the gathering dusk like a figure from a dime novel, his black hat pulled low against the setting sun. The horse beneath him moved with the fluid grace of expensive breeding, its coat gleaming despite the dust of the trail. As they passed beneath her window, Margaret caught a glimpse of the brand on the horse's flank, the distinctive Wheeler W that marked the finest horseflesh in 3 territories. The man dismounted with practiced ease outside the Silver Creek bank, his spurs chiming softly against the wooden sidewalk. Even from her second-floor vantage point, Margaret could see why Jackson Wheeler commanded respect. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had built his own destiny from the ground up, who answered to no one but himself. "Mr. Wheeler!" Mr. Peterson's voice carried clearly from the bank's entrance, its usual pompous tone replaced by something approaching, genuine warmth. "We weren't expecting you in town until next week's cattle auction. Change of plans, James." Wheeler's voice was deep, with an educated accent that surprised Margaret. "Got word about a Morgan stallion coming through on tomorrow's train. Thought I'd take a look myself instead of sending my foreman." Their conversation continued, but Margaret's attention was drawn to the horse. It stood quietly, unbound by any tether, obviously too well trained to need one. Its conformation was perfect, strong. Shoulders, deep chest, powerful hindquarters. Without thinking, she found herself analyzing its gait potential, remembering the horses she'd helped train at her uncle's stable in Vermont during happier summers of her youth. "Beautiful animal, isn't he?" Margaret started. During her contemplation of the horse, Wheeler had finished his business and now stood looking up at her window, his face shadowed by his hat brim. This close, she could see that his features were weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and determination. His eyes, though, his eyes were unexpectedly kind. "The Morgan bloodline," she said, fighting the urge to step back from the window. "You can see it in the arch of the neck and the way he carries his tail." Something like interest flickered across Wheeler's face. "You know horses? I used to help train them before." She stopped, suddenly conscious of her position as a failed mail-order bride, speaking from a boarding house window to the territory's most successful rancher. But Wheeler didn't seem to notice her discomfort. "Tomorrow's horse," he said, "is supposed to be from the same line as this one. I could use a knowledgeable eye when I evaluate him." He paused, then added with careful casualness, "Mrs. Henderson usually serves breakfast at 7. I'll be riding past around 8 if you'd care to accompany me to the train station." Before Margaret could form a response, he touched the brim of his hat and swung back into the saddle. Horse and rider disappeared into the deepening twilight, leaving her to wonder if the entire encounter had been a product of her imagination. Mrs. Henderson's knock barely registered through her daze. The older woman entered with fresh towels, took one look at Margaret's face, and set the linens down with a knowing smile. "I see you've met Mr. Wheeler. He wants me to look at a horse with him tomorrow." Margaret turned from the window. "Why would he ask me? He doesn't even know me." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were shrewd. Jackson Wheeler didn't build the largest ranch in the territory by being a poor judge of character. If he asked for your opinion, it's because he sees something worth valuing. She straightened the towels with precise movements. "Though I will say, in all the years I've known him, I've never heard of him asking anyone's advice about horseflesh." Before, later that night, lying in her narrow bed, Margaret found herself remembering the way Wheeler had looked at her. Directly, without the flinching assessment she'd grown used to from the town's men. He'd seen her knowledge before her appearance, her capability before her size. It was just about the horse, she told herself firmly, a simple business matter. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't quite suppress a flutter of hope in her chest, small but persistent, like a bird beating its wings against a storm. Margaret rose before dawn, taking extra care with her appearance. She chose her blue wool dress, practical enough for horses, but with subtle embroidery at the collar that brought out her eyes. Her hair she plaited in a crown around her head, secure enough to withstand wind and riding. Mrs. Henderson's breakfast was a quiet affair, broken only by the clink of silverware, and Miss Porter's pointed comments about proper ladies not riding astride. Margaret focused on her eggs and toast, conscious of the pending hour. Precisely at 8, hoofbeats sounded outside. Margaret stepped onto the boarding house porch, heart thundering beneath her composed exterior. Jackson Wheeler sat atop a different horse today, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes. "Miss Sullivan?" He touched his hat brim. "I took the liberty of bringing Daisy for you. She's steady as summer sunshine and smart enough to make us both look good." The mare's tack was quality. Leather well-oiled and maintained. Margaret approached slowly, letting Daisy catch her scent. The horse nickered softly, turning to regard her with gentle interest. "She's lovely," Margaret said, running expert hands down the mare's legs, checking her conformation. "Quarter horse dam with maybe some Cleveland Bay further back?" Wheeler's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most folks don't spot the Cleveland Bay. My father brought her grandsire over from England when I was a boy." He dismounted smoothly, moving to help her up, then paused. "You'll want to ride aside, I expect." Margaret hesitated only a moment. "Actually, if it's all the same to you, I prefer astride for working with horses. Hard to evaluate movement from a side saddle." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Practical woman. He adjusted the stirrups with practiced efficiency, then offered his hand. Margaret gathered her skirts and mounted with the ease of long practice, settling comfortably into the well-worn saddle. They rode in companionable silence through town, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed their passage. Outside the town limits, Wheeler led them off the main road onto a narrow trail that wound through stands of mesquite and cedar. "Your uncle's stable," he said finally. "Where was it?" "Vermont, near Burlington." The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass. He trained carriage horses mostly, but had a few thoroughbreds for wealthy clients. "Long way from Vermont to Texas. Long way from anywhere to Texas, I suspect." She smiled slightly, "though I'm beginning to see its appeal." They emerged from the trees onto a rise overlooking the railroad station. Wheeler drew his horse to a halt, studying her with those direct eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. "Why did you come, Miss Sullivan? Really?" The question should have felt intrusive, but somehow didn't. "Because sometimes duty and dreams point in the same direction." She met his gaze steadily. "My father is ill. The doctors in Boston are expensive. And I wanted more. Something different than endless rows of neat stitches and careful economies." He nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And now? After 2 weeks of Silver Creek's famous hospitality? Now I have exactly 8 days to find a miracle, or I'll be heading back to those neat stitches with my tail between my legs." The train whistle sounded in the distance, a long, mournful note. Wheeler turned his horse toward the station. "Well, then, Miss Sullivan, let's go see about that miracle." The Morgan Stallion proved everything Margaret had hoped, and more than Jackson Wheeler had expected. She'd spotted the slight favoring of its left hind leg that the seller tried to dismiss as travel stiffness, potentially saving Wheeler hundreds in veterinary bills down the line. Her quiet suggestions about testing its response to commands had revealed both intelligence and a willing temperament beneath its spirited exterior. "Course of rest and gentle exercise," she'd said confidently, running knowing hands down the horse's cannon bones. "A month, maybe 2, and he'll be sound as a bell. Good bloodlines show through given time and proper care." Now riding beside Wheeler toward his ranch, Margaret couldn't help but wonder if he'd heard the echo of her own situation in those words. The Wheeler Ranch spread out before them like a kingdom from a fairy tale. White-painted fences stretched toward the horizon, enclosing emerald pastures where horses grazed in the late morning sun. The main house rose from a gentle hill, not the crude cabin she'd expected, but a handsome two-story structure of dressed stone with wide verandas and tall windows. "My father built the original cabin," Wheeler said, noting her expression. Added, "On bit by bit as the herd grew. My mother always said a proper house meant we were here to stay." Workers called greetings as they rode past the outer buildings. Margaret noted the well-maintained barn, the tidy bunkhouse, the forge sending up smoke signals of industry. Everything spoke of prosperity, built on attention to detail and hard work. Mr. Wheeler, a weathered man in his 50s, emerged from the barn, leading a chestnut mare. "Wasn't expecting you back, so—" His voice trailed off as he spotted Margaret. "Tom, this is Miss Sullivan. She just saved us from making an expensive mistake with that Morgan." Wheeler dismounted, moving to help Margaret down before she could protest. "Miss Sullivan, Tom Matthews, my foreman for 15 years. The foreman's handshake was careful but genuine. "Any friend of the boss is welcome here, especially one who knows horses." He gestured to the mare he was leading. "Maybe you'd care to look at Sugar here. Been favoring her right front since Tuesday, but I can't find the trouble." Wheeler started to intervene, but Margaret was already moving forward, greeting the horse with gentle hands and quiet words. "May I?" At Tom's nod, she ran practiced fingers down the leg in question, noting the mare's reactions. "Ah, here." She pressed lightly just above the hoof. "Feel that slight heat? Could be the beginning of an abscess. Soaking in Epsom salts twice daily should draw it out before it becomes serious." Tom's eyebrows rose appreciatively. "Been saying for years we need someone with a proper eye for horsekeeping." He shot a meaningful look at his employer before leading Sugar back to the barn. "He's not wrong," Wheeler said quietly. "Ranch this size needs more than just cowboys. Needs someone who can see the small things before they become big problems." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "Would you like to see the rest?" The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and discoveries. The kitchen garden, tended by Mrs. Martinez, who provided meals for the ranch hands. The spring house where wheels of cheese aged on cedar planks. The nursery paddock where a new foal tottered on spindly legs beside its watchful dam. In every face, Margaret saw the same thing: respect for Wheeler, tempered with genuine affection. This was no kingdom ruled by fear or mere money. This was a community, bound together by shared purpose and mutual regard. "You've built something remarkable here," she said as they paused by the main corral. A dozen yearlings frolicked inside, showing off bloodlines worth a small fortune. "Built it from scratch," Wheeler agreed, his voice distant with memory. "First horse I bought was a broken-down cavalry mount nobody else would touch. Nursed him back, trained him up, sold him for enough to buy 2 more, then 4, then 8. He turned to face her fully. "Thing about building from nothing, Miss Sullivan, makes a man appreciate folks who see value where others don't." The weight of his gaze made her breath catch. Before she could respond, a dinner bell rang from the main house. "Stay," he said. "Share a meal. Meet the rest of the family." At her startled look, he smiled. "Ranch this size, everyone who works. Here is family in one way or another." Margaret knew she should refuse. Proper ladies didn't dine unchaperoned at bachelor ranches. But looking at the warmth in his eyes, the quiet acceptance in his manner, she found herself nodding. "I'd like that very much, Mr. Wheeler." "Jackson," he corrected gently. "Think it's time you called me Jackson." The ranch hand's dining room hummed with conversation and the clatter of plates. Margaret sat beside Jackson at the long oak table, acutely aware of curious glances cast her way. Mrs. Martinez's cooking filled the air with the aroma of beef stew and fresh-baked bread, hearty fare for people who worked from sunup to sundown. "Pass the biscuits, Miss Sullivan." Tom Matthews smiled warmly from across the table. "And maybe share that story about the Morgan stallion." boys could learn something about proper horse evaluation. Before Margaret could respond, a commotion erupted outside. Young Jimmy, one of the stable boys, burst through the door, his face pale. Wild mustangs in the north paddock got in with the yearlings. Jackson was on his feet instantly, others following. How'd it get through the fence? Storm last night must have weakened the post. He's riling up the whole herd, sir. Margaret followed them out, her heart racing. The north paddock was chaos. A magnificent black mustang, all fury and untamed. Power, sending the valuable yearlings into a panic. Ranch hands were gathering ropes, but in the confined space, there was real danger of injury to both horses and men. Without thinking, Margaret kicked off her shoes and hiked up her skirts. Securing them quickly, before anyone could stop her, she slipped through the fence rails. Miss Sullivan, Jackson's voice carried equal parts concern and command. Get back! But Margaret was already moving, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, but carried across the paddock. Easy now, beautiful. Easy there. The mustang's ears flicked toward her, nostrils flaring. He wheeled, preparing to charge, but Margaret stood her ground. She began to hum, an old lullaby her mother used to sing. Her body language relaxed and unthreatening. That's right, she murmured. Nothing to fear here. Just you and me having a quiet talk. The horse snorted, pawing the ground. Margaret continued humming, taking one small step forward, then another. The yearlings, sensing the change in energy, began to calm. Your mother must have been something special, she said conversationally to the mustang. I see Andalusian in your bearing. Probably came north with the Spanish herds. Such proud bloodlines shouldn't end in fear and fighting. She was close enough now to see the whites of his eyes, the trembling of his muscles. One wrong move, and he could easily kill her. But Margaret kept humming, kept talking, her voice a gentle thread drawing him in. My uncle had one like you, she continued. Everyone said he was devil-spawned. Turned out he just needed someone to listen, to see. Past the fear to the heart beneath. The mustang's breathing slowed. His head lowered slightly, more curious now than threatening. Margaret reached out, not touching, just offering her hand as an option. There now. Isn't this better than fighting? Time seemed to stretch like warm honey. Then, slowly, deliberately, the proud horse stepped forward and pressed his velvet nose into her palm. A collective breath released from the watchers at the fence. Margaret heard Jackson's voice giving quiet orders, getting the yearlings to safety, bringing a halter, but she stayed focused on the mustang, maintaining the fragile connection until the immediate crisis passed. Only when the horse was safely secured did she become aware of her state. Skirts hitched up, feet dirty, hair escaping its pins. She turned to find Jackson watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. I apologize for the impropriety, she began, but he shook his head. Miss Sullivan, he said slowly, I've seen veterans with 30 years' experience who couldn't have handled that better. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Where did you learn that technique? My uncle's stable. We specialized in difficult cases. She smoothed her skirts down, trying to regain some dignity. People would bring their unmanageable horses to us. Usually, they just needed patience, understanding, and a woman's touch. His eyes held a glimmer of something that might have been admiration. Sometimes. She met his gaze steadily. The proudest creatures often respond best to gentleness. Force just makes them fight harder. Jackson glanced at the now calm mustang, then back to her. Reckon there's wisdom in that, beyond just horses. Around them, the ranch hands were returning to their interrupted dinner, but not before Margaret caught the looks of respect on their weathered faces. She had passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. You should join us again tomorrow, Jackson said as they walked back to the house. Got some other horses I'd value your opinion on. Margaret smiled, understanding the offer for what it was. Not just employment, but acceptance. A chance to belong. I'd like that, she said softly. I'd like that very much. News traveled fast in Silver Creek. By the time Margaret returned to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house that evening, The story of her encounter with the wild mustang had grown to near mythical proportions. She overheard whispers as she passed the mercantile, some admiring, others decidedly less so. "Unnatural, if you ask me," came Mrs. Whitaker's sharp voice through the open window of the millinery shop. "A proper lady doesn't go climbing into paddocks with wild horses and hiking up her skirts in full view of the ranch hands. What must Mr. Wheeler think?" Margaret kept walking, head high, though the words stung more than she cared to admit. At the boarding-house steps, she found an unexpected ally in the widow Chen, who was delivering fresh laundry. "They talk because they fear," the usually silent woman said in her careful English. "Strong woman makes weak people nervous." She pressed a wrapped package into Margaret's hands. "Lucky red thread for new beginnings." Inside the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson was fending off a delegation of concerned citizens, led by Mr. Peterson's wife. Their voices carried clearly to the entrance hall. "Really, Mrs. Henderson, as the moral guardian of your establishment, you must see how inappropriate." "What I see," Mrs. Henderson cut in crisply, "is that Miss Sullivan has been offered a position as horse trainer at the Wheeler Ranch. A perfectly respectable occupation." "Horse trainer?" Mrs. Peterson's voice dripped disbelief. "Is that what they're calling it? A single woman spending her days alone with half a dozen ranch hands, Tom Matthews and his wife, Mrs. Martinez, and a barn full of horses worth more than your husband's bank." Mrs. Henderson's tone could have frozen hell itself. "And if you're implying anything about Jackson Wheeler's character, I suggest you remember who holds the mortgage on half the businesses in town." Margaret slipped upstairs, her heart warming at her landlady's defense. In her room, she found a note had been delivered in her absence. The handwriting was bold, masculine. "Miss Sullivan, the Mustang has been asking for you. Perhaps you'd consider taking breakfast at the ranch tomorrow. Mrs. Martinez makes excellent apple hotcakes. J.W." She was smiling at the note when another knock came. Miss Porter entered without waiting for a response, her thin face pinched with concern. "Margaret, dear, I feel it my Christian duty to warn you." The schoolteacher perched on the edge of the chair like a bird about to take flight. "People are talking. Your reputation—" "My reputation," Margaret interrupted quietly. "You mean the reputation I had when I arrived? When every man in town took one look at me and decided I wasn't worth courting? That reputation." Miss Porter flushed. "I'm only thinking of your future. If things don't work out with Mr. Wheeler, you'll find other opportunities severely limited." "Other opportunities?" Margaret laughed softly. "Like teaching? Or being someone's quiet, proper wife who never speaks above a whisper or takes up too much space?" She shook her head. "I tried fitting into those boxes, Miss Porter. They were too small for my soul." The schoolteacher rose stiffly. "I see you've made your choice. I only pray you don't come to regret it." She paused at the door. "They're saying he only hired you because he feels sorry for you." The words were meant to wound, and they did. But Margaret thought of the way Jackson looked at her when she worked with his horses, not with pity, but with genuine respect. She thought of the ranch hands' faces when she calmed the Mustang, of Mrs. Martinez saving her an extra biscuit at dinner, of Tom Matthews asking her opinion on a lame mare. "No," she said firmly, "he hired me because I'm good at what I do. And if the good people of Silver Creek can't understand that, then perhaps the problem lies with them, not me." After Miss Porter left, Margaret sat at her small desk and began 2 letters. The first was to her parents, telling them of her new position and the surprising turn her life had taken. The second was shorter. "Mr. Wheeler, I would be delighted to join you for breakfast. The Mustang and I have much to discuss. MS." As she sealed the letters, she caught her reflection in the window glass. The woman who looked back at her stood, straighter, held her head higher than the one who had arrived in Silver Creek 2 weeks ago. Let them talk, she thought. Some things were worth a little scandal. The weather turned treacherous with the suddenness typical of Texas springs. Margaret had been at the ranch for just over a week when the storm clouds began gathering on the horizon, transforming the morning's crystal blue sky into an ominous slate gray. She was working with the Mustang, now named Midnight, when Tom Matthews came running from the main house. "Storm's coming fast! Jackson wants all hands helping get the horses to the shelter paddock." The air had grown heavy, electric. Midnight sensed it too, dancing nervously at the end of his lead rope. In the distance, thunder rolled like cavalry drums. "I'll take the north pasture," Margaret called to Tom, already moving. She'd learned the ranch's layout over the past days, spending dawn to dusk working with the horses and earning her place among the hands. The wind was picking up as she reached the pasture gate, carrying the scent of rain and something else, a metallic tang that old-timers called tornado weather. A dozen yearlings gazed nervously at the darkening sky. "Margaret!" Jackson's voice carried over the rising wind. He appeared on horseback, his dun stallion fighting the gusts. "Leave them, it's too dangerous." But she was already inside the gate, moving with the quiet confidence that calmed fractious horses. The yearlings knew her now, trusted her. When she called, they came. The first fat drops of rain were falling as she began herding them toward the shelter paddock. Jackson dismounted to help, working in wordless synchronization with her. They'd developed this rhythm over the past week, each anticipating the other's movements, reading signals too subtle for others to notice. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a thunderclap that made the yearlings bolt. Margaret's quick whistle brought them back, but not before one young filly panicked and broke away, heading straight for the weakened section of fence. Without hesitation, Margaret ran. Her skirts were soaked and heavy, her boots slipping in the rapidly muddying ground, but she couldn't let the filly hurt herself. Behind her she heard Jackson shout something lost to the wind. The filly reached the fence and jumped, too soon, too low. Margaret's heart stopped as she saw the horse's legs tangle in the top rail. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, hands reaching to protect the filly's head as she fell. They went down together in the mud. Margaret felt a sharp pain in her shoulder, but kept her grip on the filly's halter, speaking soft words that were swept away by the storm. The young horse's eyes rolled white with fear, but she stayed still, trusting Margaret even in her panic. Then Jackson was there, his strong hands checking them both for injury. The rain plastered his dark hair to his face, but his eyes burned with something more than just concern. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen," he said, helping her up. His hand lingered on her waist, steadying her. "Are you hurt?" "Just bruised." Margaret pushed her sodden hair from her face. "The filly?" "Scraped up, but nothing serious." His voice softened. "Thanks to you." Together they got the filly up and guided her to join the others in the shelter paddock. The storm was directly overhead now, turning day to twilight. Lightning illuminated the ranch in stark flashes, followed by thunder that shook the ground. "Inside," Jackson ordered, but not unkindly. "You're soaked through." The main house was closer than the bunkhouse. He led her to the kitchen door, where Mrs. Martinez took one look at them and began clucking in rapid-fire Spanish. Before Margaret could protest, she was whisked upstairs to change into borrowed dry clothes, while her own were set to dry by the fire. When she came back down, she found Jackson in his study, also changed, building up the fire. He turned at her. Entrance, and something flickered in his expression at the sight of her in simple cotton dress and shawl, her damp hair falling loose around her shoulders. "You could have been killed today," he said quietly. "The filly could have been killed." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I couldn't let that happen." "No," he agreed, moving closer. "You couldn't. It's not in your nature to let any creature suffer." His hand rose, almost of its own accord, to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. "Do you have any idea how rare that is? How precious?" The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the storm raged on, but in here, time seemed to stop. Margaret was acutely aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from him. of the way his eyes had darkened like the storm-swept sky. "Jackson," she whispered, not sure if it was warning or invitation. Before either could move, a pounding came at the front door. Tom's voice carried through. "Boss, the creek's rising. We need to move the cattle to higher ground." The moment shattered. Jackson stepped back, though his eyes never left her face. "Stay here," he said, "please, where I know you're safe." But they both knew she wouldn't. Couldn't. That wasn't her nature either. "I'll get my boots," she said. Simply. His smile was brief but full of understanding. "I never really thought otherwise." The telegram arrived 3 days after the storm, delivered by young Jimmy, who'd ridden out from town specially. Margaret was in the training ring with Midnight, working on his response to voice commands, when she saw the boys approach. Something in Jimmy's expression made her heart sink, even before he handed over the yellow envelope. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, the morning sun suddenly feeling less warm. "Father, worse, stop, doctor says months, not years. Stop, mother needs you, stop, come home, stop." The words blurred before her eyes. She was dimly aware of Midnight nudging her shoulder, seeking the treats she usually carried. From across the yard, she heard Jackson's voice approaching, discussing breeding lines with Tom. "Miss Sullivan?" Jimmy shifted uncertainly. "Do you want to send a reply?" Margaret folded the telegram carefully, tucking it into her pocket. "Not yet, thank you. I'll come into town later." Jackson reached the fence as Jimmy rode away. One look at her face and his easy manner vanished. "What's wrong?" She tried to smile, failed. "My father, he's—" Her voice caught. Without a word, Jackson opened the gate and came to her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Tell me," he said quietly. So she did, words spilling out about her father's worsening condition, her mother's struggle to manage alone, the weight of duty pulling her back east. Jackson listened in silence, his face unreadable. "I have to go," she finished softly. "They need me, I know." His voice was gentle, but something else lurked beneath it, an emotion she couldn't quite name. "When will you leave?" "The next eastbound train is Thursday. 3 days away. Such a short time to say goodbye to everything she'd found here." Jackson nodded slowly. "I'll have Tom drive you to the station." He turned as if to go, then stopped. Unless you'd consider bringing them here." The words came fast, as if he'd been holding them back. "The air's better here for invalids. We have space in the main house. Your mother could—" "Jackson." Margaret's heart twisted at the hope in his voice. They'd never survive the journey. Father can barely leave his bed now. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Then let me help. I can arrange for a nurse in Boston, cover the medical bills." "No!" The word came out sharper than she intended. "I mean, thank you, but no. This is my responsibility. My family." "And what are we?" The question hung in the air between them. Jackson stepped closer, his voice dropping. "What am I to you, Margaret?" She couldn't meet his eyes, afraid of what she might see there, or what he might see in hers. "You're my employer, is that all?" The morning breeze carried the scent of sage and leather, so uniquely him, it made her chest ache. "It's all I can allow you to be right now." His hand rose as if to touch her face, then fell back to his side. "You'll come back?" "I don't know." The honest answer hurt them both. Father could linger for months. Mother will need help after, and the medical bills will be considerable. Jackson's voice had gone carefully neutral. More than a horse trainer's salary could cover. The implication was clear. In Boston, she could return to seamstress work, taking in extra sewing to help pay the doctors, or "Mr. Whitaker's offer still stands," she said quietly. "He made that clear in church on Sunday. A publisher's wife would have the means to help her family. And that's what you want?" There was an edge to his voice now. "To be the society wife of a man who wouldn't look at you twice 2 weeks ago?" "What I want doesn't matter." The words burst out before she could stop them. "It never has. I came west to make a good marriage and help my family. Just because I found something else instead doesn't change my duty." "Something else?" Jackson moved closer still, until she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "What did you find, Margaret?" She took a step back, trying to clear her head. "Mr. Wheeler, back to formality now." His laugh held no humor. "After everything. Please." Her voice cracked on the word. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." For a long moment he stood looking at her, and Margaret thought she glimpsed something like pain in his eyes before his expression shuttered closed. "Take the rest of the day," he said finally, his tone businesslike once more. "Make whatever arrangements you need in town. Tom will help you pack your things from the bunkhouse tomorrow." He turned and walked away, his boots kicking up small. Clouds of dust. Margaret watched him go, her heart feeling as heavy as the telegram in her pocket. Dawn broke grey and silent over the Wheeler ranch, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Margaret had barely slept, spending the night packing her few belongings and writing a detailed care guide for each horse she'd worked with. She was checking midnight one last time when Mrs. Martinez came running toward the stable. "Señorita Margaret, come quick, the new Morgan." The stallion they'd evaluated in town lay thrashing in his stall, sweat darkening his coat despite the cool morning. One look at his distended belly, and Margaret's heart sank. She'd seen this before, during her uncle's worst summer. "Colic," she said grimly. "Bad case. Where's Jackson?" "Supply run to Fort Worth. Tom, too." Mrs. Martinez wrung her hands. "Others out with herd. Just ranch girls here." Margaret was already moving, pulling off her traveling jacket. "Get me warm. Water, clean cloths, and the longest rope you can find. And send someone for the town doctor." "Dr. Weber's away at birth in Mesa Creek," Mrs. Martinez called after her. "Won't be back till tonight." Of course he was. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Then we do this ourselves." The next hours blurred into a desperate race against time. Margaret got the stallion up, kept him walking despite his attempts to roll. When he tried to rear, she spoke in the same soothing tone she'd used with Midnight, though her arms ached from holding the lead rope. She was so focused on the horse, she didn't hear the approaching rider until his shadow fell across the paddock. "Margaret?" Jackson's voice carried a note she'd never heard before, concern mixed with something deeper. "Jimmy flagged me down in town, said there was trouble." She didn't turn around, keeping her attention on the suffering horse. "Severe colic. He's been down 4 hours. If we can't get it to pass..." She didn't need to finish. They both knew what it meant. Not just the loss of an expensive horse, but the end of their breeding program before it began. All their careful plans wasted. Jackson's boots crunched on the packed earth as he approached. Without a word, he took the lead rope from her trembling hands. "What do you need?" "More warm water and liniment. There's a special blend in my trunk." The brown bottle. She realized what she'd said a moment too late. Her trunk, packed for tomorrow's departure. Jackson's jaw tightened, but he merely nodded to Mrs. Martinez, who hurried to fetch the items. They worked in silence as the morning wore into afternoon. When the stallion needed walking, they traded off, moving in seamless coordination despite the tension between them. When he finally passed the obstruction, dropping to rest in clean straw, they both sagged with relief. "He'll need monitoring through the night," Margaret said, her voice hoarse from hours of gentle encouragement. "Warm mash every 2 hours, small amounts. And someone should stay..." "You're leaving." Jackson's words fell like stones into still water. "Tomorrow, early train." She began cleaning the medical supplies, unable to meet his eyes. "I've written out all the treatment protocols. Mrs. Martinez can..." "Damn it, Margaret!" The burst of emotion made her jump. Jackson ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You just saved a horse worth more than most men make in a year. You've transformed our training program, gained the respect of every hand on this ranch. And you're just going to walk away? For what, to be some newspaperman's trophy wife?" "You know why," she whispered. "Do I?" He stepped closer, and suddenly she could smell leather and sage and everything she was trying so hard to leave behind. "Because from where I stand, you're running away. Not towards something, but from it. That's not fair." Her voice cracked. "My family needs me, and I need you." The words hung in the air between them. Jackson took another step, close enough now that she had to tip her head back to meet his gaze. The ranch needs you. Unless you don't feel it too, this thing between us. Tell me I'm imagining it, Margaret. Tell me you feel nothing when I'm near. Tell me your heart doesn't race when I say your name." She closed her eyes against the truth in his. "Please don't." His hand came up to cup her cheek, calloused palm gentle against her skin. "Look at me. If you can look me in the eye and say you feel nothing, I'll let you go. I'll drive you to the station myself." Margaret stood frozen, torn between duty and desire, between the life she owed her family and the one her heart yearned for. Behind them, the rescued stallion nickered softly. A pounding of hooves interrupted the moment. Tom's voice carried from the yard. "Boss, telegraph from Fort Worth. You're gonna want to see this." Tom dismounted in a cloud of dust, waving a yellow telegram. His expression was unreadable as he handed it to Jackson. "Came from your banker in Fort Worth. Said it couldn't wait." Margaret watched Jackson's face as he read, saw the color drain from it. Without a word, he thrust the telegram at her, turning to stare out across the paddocks. "Sullivan and Sons, Stables, Stop, Burlington, Vermont. Stop requesting reference for Margaret Sullivan. Stop, daughter of former owner Thomas. Sullivan query." Her hands began to shake. "How did they—" "Keep reading." Jackson's voice was rough. "Records. Show Stable, sold to J. Wheeler Enterprises, 1870. Stop, current status and well-being of Sullivan family requested. Stop, urgent reply needed." "Stop, I don't understand." But even as she said it, memories began to surface. The strange familiarity of some of Jackson's training techniques. The way he'd known about the Cleveland Bay bloodlines. And hadn't her uncle mentioned a quiet young man who'd bought the stable after father's accident? "5 years ago," Jackson said quietly, still not looking at her, "I was expanding east, looking for good breeding stock, solid bloodlines. Found this stable in Vermont. Owner had been injured, could barely walk. But his horses," he shook his head, "finest I'd ever seen. Father's accident." Margaret's voice seemed to come from far away. "The fall that started everything. He didn't want to sell. Said it was his daughter's inheritance. But the medical bills—" Jackson finally turned to face her. "I bought it at full price, more than full price. Meant to keep him on as manager, but he was too proud. Moved to Boston instead. All this time." The telegram crumpled in Margaret's fist. "You knew who I was. You knew about my family." "Not at first. Sullivan's a common name. But when you mentioned your uncle's stable, started showing techniques I'd only seen there." He took a step toward her. "I had my banker investigate. The telegram only confirmed it." "So what was this?" Heat flooded her cheeks. "Guilt? Pity? Trying to make amends by hiring the poor ruined gentleman's daughter? Margaret, is that why you never—" Her voice caught. "All those moments when I thought you might. Was it just guilt? Guilt?" Something sparked in his eyes. "You think I offered you a job out of guilt? You think I've been fighting these feelings, watching you with my horses, seeing you bloom here because of guilt?" He closed the distance. Between them in 2 strides, hands coming up to frame her face. "I bought your father's stable because I saw its worth. I hired you because you're brilliant with horses. And I've been falling in love with you because you're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known." Margaret's heart stopped at the word love. "Jackson, let me help them," he said urgently. "Not out of guilt, not out of duty, but because they're your family and you love them and I love you. You can't just—" "I can. I do." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "Your father's stable isn't just another property to me. It's part of what built all this." He gestured to the ranch around them. "Let me restore it. Let me give him back his life's work. Give your mother back her home. Not as charity, but as a partnership. With you. With me. Marry me." The words were simple, direct. "Not because you need help for your family. Not because I need a horse trainer. Marry me because what we have, this connection, this understanding, is worth building a life on." Margaret looked up into his eyes, seeing past the successful rancher to the young man who'd recognized the worth of a failing stable, who'd tried to help her family even before he knew her, who'd seen her worth when no one else had. "Yes," she whispered. Behind them, midnight nickered softly as if in approval. Word of their engagement spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. By sunset, Margaret could see riders approaching the ranch, the town's self-appointed moral committee, no doubt, led by Mrs. Peterson and Mrs. Whitaker. "Let me handle this," Jackson said, watching from his study window. But Margaret placed a hand on his arm. "No, we face it together." They met the delegation on the front porch, standing shoulder to shoulder. Mrs. Peterson didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Wheeler, surely you can't be serious about this arrangement." She spoke as if Margaret weren't present. After all, the girl came here as a mail-order bride. What will people say? "They'll say I'm the luckiest man in Texas." Jackson's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "If they know what's good for them." Mr. Whitaker stepped forward, his publisher's instinct smelling a story. "Come now, Wheeler. We all know what this looks like. A wealthy rancher, a desperate woman with a sick father." "Careful." Jackson's warning was soft, but carried clearly in the evening air. "You're speaking about my future wife." "Exactly our point." Mrs. Peterson's voice rose shrilly. "Your position in society demands certain standards, and Miss Sullivan, while no doubt very good with horses, hardly meets—" "I am right here," Margaret interrupted quietly. All eyes turned to her. "And I can speak for myself." She stepped forward, back straight, head high. "Yes, I came here as a mail-order bride. Yes, my father is ill. And yes, I love Jackson Wheeler, not for his money or his position, but for his heart." She met their scandalized gazes one by one. "As for society's standards, I've seen what they're worth in this town. The same people who judged me wanting 2 weeks ago now fear I'm somehow trying to rise above my station." "But surely—" "You must see," Mrs. Whitaker began, "your reputation—" "My reputation," Margaret laughed softly. "The reputation that had you all turning up your noses at me, that reputation—" She felt Jackson's hand slip into hers, warm and supporting. "I'll tell you what I see. I see people so afraid of anything different that they'd rather believe in scandal than love. I see a town so bound by appearances that they've forgotten how to look into hearts." "Well," Mrs. Peterson drew herself up, "if that's how you feel, don't expect to be welcomed in proper society." "Proper society?" Jackson's quiet voice cut through the tension. "The same society that depends on my business to survive. The same proper ladies who'll find their mortgages suddenly due if they don't show my wife every courtesy. Are you threatening us, Mr. Wheeler?" "Not at all." His smile was dangerous. "Simply clarifying the social order you seem so concerned about." After they'd gone, Margaret turned to him. "You shouldn't have said that. About the mortgages." "Why not? It's true." He drew her close. "Besides, did you really want to attend their tea parties?" "No, but—" She sighed against his chest. "I don't want to cause problems for you. Your position here—" "My position?" Jackson tipped her chin up. "My position is beside you. Everything else is just details. Even when the newspaper runs, 'It's scandal piece tomorrow?' Let them. Though I doubt they will." His eyes held a glint of amusement. "Whitaker's not fool enough to risk his advertising revenue. And speaking of newspapers," he pulled a telegram from his pocket. "This came while they were here, from Boston." Margaret's heart jumped. "Father, better than we thought. Doctor says he could travel with proper care. I've arranged a private rail car. They can be here within 2 weeks." Tears sprang to her eyes. "Jackson, I told you, partnership." He brushed away a tear with his thumb. "Though we should probably wait to tell your father I'm the one who bought his stable, at least until after the wedding." Despite everything, Margaret found herself laughing. "Coward." "Strategist," he corrected, pulling her closer. "And speaking of strategy, how do you feel about making that wedding sooner rather than later, before your parents arrive?" "Why, Mr. Wheeler?" She smiled up at him. Are you trying to avoid giving my father a chance to object? More like trying to avoid giving this town any more reason to gossip. His eyes softened. And because I don't want to waste another day pretending I'm just your employer. Margaret's answer was to rise on tiptoe and kiss him. Mrs. Henderson's face lit up when Margaret entered the boarding house. "There's my girl." She embraced Margaret warmly, then held her at arm's length. "Let me look at you. Happiness becomes you, child." "I've come to give notice," Margaret began, but the older woman waved her off. "Nonsense. This will always be your home in town. Now, tell me everything." She steered Margaret toward the parlor. "Though I must say, tongues are wagging something fierce about the speed of this wedding." "Let them wag." Margaret settled into her favorite chair. "Jackson thinks, and I agree, that a quick, quiet ceremony is best, before my parents arrive." "Wise man." Mrs. Henderson poured tea with practiced grace. "Though I don't imagine you'll get your wish about the quiet part. Not with every family from here to Fort Worth angling for an invitation." She was right. Despite their hopes for simplicity, the Wheeler name carried too much weight to avoid. Some ceremony. The mercantile's windows suddenly displayed their finest fabrics. The milliner, miraculous, found time in her schedule. Even Mrs. Whittaker, perhaps sensing which way the wind blew, sent a handwritten note offering the newspapers most sincere congratulations. "Vultures," Mrs. Chen commented, helping Margaret try on wedding dresses. "Yesterday they scorn. Today they smile. Tomorrow?" She shrugged expressively, but not everyone had changed their tune. Margaret felt the sideways glances as she walked through town, heard the whispers that followed her into shops. Outside the bank, she overheard Mrs. Peterson holding court. "Clearly with child," the banker's wife was saying. "Why else such rush? Poor Mr. Wheeler, trapped by that calculating—" "Mrs. Peterson," Margaret's voice cut through the gossip like a knife. The women turned, faces flushing. "I believe you're speaking about your future landlord's wife. Perhaps you'd care to repeat your concerns directly." The older woman sputtered, but Margaret had already moved on, head high. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her. Hurt. Inside the bank, Mr. Peterson was obsequious, falling over himself to help her set up accounts for the ranch's horse training program. "We're so pleased to be handling the Wheeler business," he said, the same man who dismissed her 2 weeks ago. "And may I say, you'll make a lovely bride." "Thank you," Margaret replied coolly. "Though I'm exactly the same woman you found so unsuitable earlier this month. Fascinating how money changes one's perspective, isn't it?" She left him stammering and red-faced. The dress fitting was another battlefield. The seamstress, clearly caught between competing social pressures, suggested something slimming, perhaps in black. "White," Margaret said firmly, "with silver threading and seed pearls." She met the woman's eyes in the mirror. "To match my horses." Word of her quiet defiance must have reached the ranch, because when she returned that evening, Jackson was waiting on the porch, a proud smile playing at his lips. "I heard you've been putting the town in its place. Does it bother you?" She let him help her down from the buggy. "That I'm not being more diplomatic? Bothers me that you have to deal with them at all." He drew her close, uncaring of who might see. "We could still elope. And miss seeing Mrs. Peterson's face when I walked down that aisle." Margaret smiled against his chest. "Not a chance." His laughter rumbled through her. "That's my girl." Then more seriously, "Letter came from your father." Margaret's heart jumped. "And he's pleased about the marriage, says he'd been worried about you out here alone." Jackson's voice held a hint of mischief. "Interesting that you didn't mention exactly who you were marrying. I thought it best to explain in person." She looked up at him. "Are you nervous?" "About telling your father I'm the man who bought his stable?" He pretended to consider. "Let's just say I'm glad I healing that Morgan stallion to offer as a peace offering." They stood together as the sun set, painting the ranch in shades of gold and promise. From the paddock, midnight nickered a greeting. "2 more days," Jackson said softly, "then nothing can separate us." But even as Margaret leaned into his embrace, A rider was approaching Silver Creek from the east, carrying news that would test their love one final time. The rider arrived just as twilight was fading into night. Margaret and Jackson were reviewing plans for converting part of the stable into a breeding nursery when Tom knocked on the study door. "Boss, someone here from Burlington. Says it's urgent." The man who entered wore city clothes, travel-stained but clearly expensive. His manner was that of someone used to being heard. "Mr. Wheeler." He barely glanced at Margaret. "I'm Edwin Porter, representing the Eastern Valley Railroad. We've been trying to reach you." Jackson's expression remained neutral. "I've received your letters. My answer hasn't changed." "Perhaps it should." Porter removed papers from his briefcase. "Our latest offer is most generous. The railroad needs your land for the new line to Fort Worth. Progress can't be stopped, Mr. Wheeler." "My ranch can't be bought." Jackson's voice was steel. "Not at any price." "No." Porter's smile was cold. "What if I told you we already own the mortgage on the Sullivan stable in Vermont?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Jackson went very still. "We've been acquiring properties along the planned route," Porter continued, "including a certain stable with significant debts. Medical bills are so costly these days. Get out." Jackson's words were barely audible. "Think carefully, Mr. Wheeler. The Sullivan stable, those precious bloodlines you valued enough to buy 5 years ago. One word from me and it's gone, along with any chance of Mr. Sullivan receiving the care he needs." Margaret found her voice. "You would use a dying man as leverage?" Porter finally looked at her properly. "Business is business, miss. Though I'm surprised Mr. Wheeler hasn't told you everything about his purchase of your father's stable. What do you mean?" "Margaret," Jackson started, but Porter spoke over him. "The accident that injured your father. Convenient timing, wasn't it? Just when Wheeler needed that land?" He smiled thinly. "Remarkable how a loose rail in the training ring could cause so much damage." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret looked at Jackson, seeing the muscle jumping in his jaw. "Is it true?" she whispered. "The rail was loose," Jackson said quietly. "I saw it during my first visit. Warned your father it needed fixing. But he was proud, didn't want advice from a younger man. So you just let him. I came back the next day to fix it myself." His eyes held hers, willing her to believe. "But I was too late. He'd already fallen." Porter cleared his throat. "Touching as this is, my offer stands. Sign over the right-of-way through your ranch, or the Sullivan stable falls to the railroad. I'll need your answer by morning." He placed his card on the desk. "I'm at the hotel in town." After he left, the study seemed too small, too close. Margaret moved to the window, looking out at the darkened ranch, her home now, or so she'd thought. "I should have told you everything," Jackson said behind her, "about seeing the loose rail, about trying to warn him. I was afraid. I'd believe what everyone in town probably will." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "That you engineered my father's accident to get his land." "Margaret." She heard him step closer but didn't turn. "Look at me, please." Slowly she faced him. In the lamplight, she saw not the powerful rancher everyone feared, but the man she'd come to love, the one who spoke gentlest to frightened horses, who knew every worker's family by name, who'd seen worth in a too-plump mail-order bride when no one else had. "I have never," he said softly, "in my entire life, wanted anything the way I want a life with you. But if you have any doubt, any question in your heart about my part in your father's accident, then we stop this now. I'll sign the railroad's papers, save your father's stable, and let you go." Margaret studied his face, the face she'd woken up thinking about every morning since that first meeting. She thought about how he'd tried to help her family before he ever met her, how he'd offered her father a manager's position even after the sale. "If you were the kind of man who'd hurt someone for gain," she said slowly, "you wouldn't be the man I fell in love with." His breath caught. "Then you believe me?" "I believe in you." She closed the distance between them. "And I believe in us." Jackson pulled her close, his heart thundering against her cheek. "We'll find another way. Your father's stable, his care. We'll figure it out together." "Yes," Margaret said. Together, out in the paddock, midnight nickered in the darkness, as if sealing their choice. Dawn found them still in the study, surrounded by papers and ledgers. They'd worked through the night, fueled by coffee and determination, searching for a solution. It was Margaret who finally found it, buried in the records of Jackson's earliest purchases. "The pass through Miller's Ridge," she said, pointing to a survey map. "You own it." Jackson leaned over her shoulder, his presence warm and solid. "The worthless strip old Miller practically gave away? What about it? Look at the railroad's proposed route." Margaret overlaid the plans Porter had left. "They need a way through the hills. Your land is the only passage for 50 miles. A slow smile spread across Jackson's face. "So, if they want a route east, they need both properties." Margaret turned to face him. "The ranch and the pass, one without the other is useless." The sun was barely up when they rode into town. They found Porter enjoying a leisurely breakfast at the hotel, his smug expression faltering at their calm demeanor. "Come to sign the papers?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Come to make a counter-offer." Jackson remained standing. "You want a route east? You'll need Miller's Pass, which I own." Porter's fork clattered against his plate. "That's impossible. Our surveys were incomplete." Margaret placed the property documents before him. "The railroad can't cross the hills without that pass, and you can't have the pass without dealing with us." What followed was the kind of negotiation Margaret had watched her father conduct 100 times, the careful dance of power and compromise. In the end, Porter left with a right-of-way through the ranch's least valuable land, paid for at triple his original offer. The Sullivan stable would remain in family hands, with guaranteed protection from future railroad expansion. "Your father would be proud," Jackson said, as they watched Porter's hastily organized departure. "That was masterful negotiation. Our first real business deal together." Margaret smiled up at him. "Think we make a good team." His answer was to kiss her, right there on the hotel porch, in full view of the morning crowd. Someone, it sounded like Mrs. Chen, whistled appreciatively. The next 2 days passed in a whirlwind. News of how they'd outmaneuvered the railroad spread quickly, transforming public opinion yet again. Now Margaret wasn't just the mail-order bride who'd caught Wheeler's eye. She was the clever woman who'd helped protect the town's interests against Eastern interference. The wedding itself was everything Margaret hadn't known she wanted. Mrs. Henderson decorated the ranch house with wildflowers and ribbons. Mrs. Martinez outdid herself with a feast that would be talked about for years. Even Mrs. Peterson sent a gift, though she claimed a headache prevented her attendance. Margaret stood before the mirror in Jackson's mother's bedroom, her bedroom now, smoothing the white silk of her dress. The seamstress had outdone herself, incorporating silver threading that caught the light like dew on morning grass. "Ready?" Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Everyone's waiting? And child?" She stepped forward to adjust Margaret's veil. "I've never seen a more beautiful bride." The ceremony passed in a blur of happiness. Margaret would later remember fragments. Tom's pride as he gave her away, the local preacher's quiet dignity, the ranch hands in their Sunday best. But most of all, she would remember Jackson's face as she walked toward him, the look in his eyes making her feel like the most precious thing in Texas. They spoke their vows beneath the old oak tree where they'd first discussed horses, its branches, casting dappled shadows like nature's own cathedral. When Jackson's voice caught on "to love and to cherish," more than one tough cowboy was seen wiping his eyes. The celebration lasted well into the night. There was dancing and laughter, stories and songs. The ranch hands presented them with a handmade gift, a new sign for the ranch entrance that read "Wheeler and Sullivan Horse Farm," causing Margaret to tear up and Jackson to clear his throat suspiciously. As the evening drew to a close, they stood together on the porch, watching their guests depart. From the paddock came the familiar sound of midnight's greeting. "Happy?" Jackson asked softly, his arms around her waist. Margaret leaned back against him feeling the solid strength that had become her home, more than I ever dreamed possible. Even without the fancy Boston marriage you came west to find? She turned in his embrace, reaching up to touch his beloved face. I came west looking for security, found love instead. She smiled. Think I got the better deal. Speaking of deals, his eyes twinkled. Wait until your father hears who really bought his stable. Margaret laughed. Don't worry, I'll protect you. I'm counting on it. He drew her closer. For the rest of our lives. Above them, stars spangled. The Texas sky like diamonds scattered on velvet, witnesses to a love that had grown from the most unexpected beginnings into something rare and precious and true. Spring came early to Texas that year. Margaret stood on the main house porch, watching the sunrise paint the ranch in shades of promise. In the paddock, Midnight grazed beside the Morgan stallion, both horses sleek and healthy in the morning. Light. The sound of wheels on the drive drew her attention. Tom was returning from the station, and in the back of the wagon sat an elderly couple, her parents, finally strong enough to travel. Her father's cane gleamed with fresh polish, but he stood straighter now, benefiting from the specialist Jackson had brought from Boston. "Ready?" Jackson appeared beside her, squeezing her hand. "Ready?" She smiled up at him. "Though you might want to stay back until I explain about the stable." He chuckled. "Coward. Strategist," she corrected, echoing his words from months ago. To their surprise, her father laughed when they finally told him. "Known all along," he said, eyes twinkling. "That specialist of yours let it slip months ago. Fine man you married, daughter. Knew what was worth saving, same as you." The Wheeler and Sullivan horse farm flourished that year. Margaret's training program drew buyers from as far as Europe, while Jackson's breeding stock only improved under their shared expertise. Even Mrs. Peterson eventually thawed, especially after Margaret helped her daughter gentle a particularly difficult pony. The town grew too, but differently than the railroad had planned. Instead of a mere way station, it became known as a place where the finest horses in Texas could be found. Margaret took particular pleasure in transforming the old marriage contract office into a training school for young women interested in horse management. "Never thought I'd end up running a school for lady horse trainers," she said one evening as she and Jackson sat on their porch watching the sunset. "Never thought. I'd find everything I needed in a mail-order bride," he replied, pulling her close. "Funny how life works out." Below in the paddock, a new foal tottered beside its mother, Midnight's first offspring, already showing the proud bearing that marked the Wheeler and Sullivan line. Margaret watched it nurse, remembering another sunset when she'd stood alone, at a window, wondering if she'd ever find a place to belong. "Penny for your thoughts?" Jackson's voice was soft in the gathering dusk. "Just thinking about worth," she said. "How sometimes the most valuable things aren't what they appear at first glance. A seemingly worthless pass through the hills, a failed mail-order bride, a wild Mustang nobody wanted. Speaking of Midnight," Jackson smiled, "reckon it's about time we gave him some company. Tom says that new mare from Kentucky's due to arrive next week." Margaret settled deeper into his embrace. "I love you," she said simply. "Love you too." He kissed her temple. "My perfect match." As darkness fell over the ranch, stars began to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their growing love, their triumph over adversity. But now they shone down on a legacy built on partnership, understanding, and the kind of love that sees past surfaces to the true, worth beneath. In the distance, Midnight nickered softly, a sound of contentment, of home.